Hello, everybody. Real quick, as you know by now, I have jury duty, and this is a difficult situation, but we're going to try to make the best of it. I thought that I would make a screencast and attach an ed puzzle to it to try to help you the very best I can get through some content until I get back. I wish I had more information. Obviously, this trial is lasting a lot longer than I had hoped. So this presentation that I put together, think of it as a greatest hits. This is all the stuff that you really need to know about Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. What years are we talking about? We're talking about 1796. That's when Adams becomes president. He's a one-term president. Then it's 1800, of course. That's the revolution of 1800 when Jefferson becomes president. He's a two-term president. That takes us to 1808. And then we have Madison, who takes us to 1816. And within there is, of course, the War of 1812. So there's a lot of things that happen with these during these years and these three presidencies, and they're all connected. And this is why we're doing the trial, by the way. So the trial, I hope it's fun. A lot of kids do enjoy it. But if you're not enjoying it, occasionally kids don't. There's a reason for it. And the reason is that the issues that come up in the trial are really the major issues for not only 1796 all the way through 1816, but I'd go even beyond that. I'd go into Monroe's presidency that goes all the way to 1824. I'd go all the way up to Andrew Jackson's presidency, which is 1836. So even though we spend a lot of time in this trial, and even more time now that I'm not in class and we've been delayed a little bit, the issues that we cover in this trial, if you understand them, you really understand this period that I would say all the way from 1796 to 1836. Here we go. Now, I've given you so much. Some of these videos I've made years past, and if this video is a little redundant, if there's things in here that were in other videos, I apologize. But I also want to point out that it's because they're important. So if you get something in here, if I talk about Jefferson and the Embargo Act, and you're like, oh, that was in the other video, please excuse me, but I will tell you it's because it's important. So let's see here. You still want a joke, right? So here we go. I have one. Since I'm in the trial, I tried to come up with a law joke. So during this trial I'm at, the lawyer is holding his briefcase the whole time. Finally, at the end, he put it down and he rested his case. That's not funny on so many different levels. All right, so let's begin. So after Washington's presidency, remember, Washington's unique. There's never going to be anyone like Washington again because he is really above politics. He's the only president who is not a part of a political party, even though he supported Hamilton more often than not, and even though occasionally he's described as a Federalist, he actually wasn't part of any major political party. He wasn't part of any political party, and in his farewell address, he actually came out against parties. So after Washington, this is when things start to happen that become a little bit more familiar. What happens after Washington? The emergence of what Washington called factions, what today we would call political parties. And these are groups of people who have a common interest, who band together for a political purpose. So sometimes they don't agree on everything. The reason I gave you kind of that wordy definition of what a political party is because sometimes these factions band together and they support things that they would otherwise not support, but because of their faction, they're sticking together, what we would call political parties. So poor John Adams is the first president who has to deal with partisan politics. The debate over the interpretation of the Constitution. So the Constitution, I pointed out to you many times in class, is a very tiny document. How to interpret it. And this is going to be a major question mark throughout American history, especially during this time period, particularly with Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. and the debate over foreign policy. And again, Jefferson and Hamilton are going to take the lead in this debate. But when we look at this through 2017 eyes, we say, well, of course, England. England is like our most powerful ally, and they have been for years. But I want you to look at this through 1796 eyes. We're only 30 years removed from the American Revolution, in which we fought England and we were aided by France. So even though we have a common language, we have a common economy, we have a common legal system as England, uh, most Americans saw France as our true ally. This is going to be a major issue between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And of course, Alexander Hamilton is very pro-English, and Jefferson, as you know, uh, adored France. So these are the major issues that are really going to last for, in some ways, they're still not, uh, they still haven't been resolved, especially the interpretation of the Constitution and political partisanship. But these are issues that are going to be particularly important during this time period, 1796 to 1836. The emergence of political parties. Let's talk about it a little bit. We see my favorite thing down here, an electoral map. We start to see party politics. We also see the emergence of sectionalism. Hamilton is a Federalist. A Federalist believes in a strong federal government. They believe in a loose construction of the Constitution. The Constitution should be interpreted loosely. We'll talk more about that in a few slides. And they are more pro-English. Jefferson is a Democratic Republican. This gets so confusing because today, of course, we have Democrats and we have Republicans. Eventually, they drop the Republican, and this is the beginning of what will become the Democratic Party. Democratic Republicans generally they support farmers. They're a very sectional party, as is the Federalists. Southern states are generally they support a loose construction of the Constitution. They support France, which kind of makes sense since France was our ally for so long. And we can see that these political parties are really very much concerned with sectional issues. I find this to be very interesting. I often say history is about today, and we still see sectional politics have a huge impact on political parties and where political parties are more popular or least popular. The debate over the Constitution. All right. So what does it mean to be a strict constructionist? So there's this play called Hamilton. I don't know if I mentioned it to you, but there's a line in the play where Hamilton is trying to convince Aaron Burr to support the Constitution. And Aaron Burr says, it's filled with contradictions. I love that line in that play because the Constitution is filled with contradictions. It says one thing on one page, and you can find almost the exact opposite thing on another page. This makes it very difficult to interpret. This means that people who have different ideas of how the Constitution can be interpreted can find proof in the Constitution to support what they believe. So with that in mind, let's talk about strict construction. Jefferson believed that, and we're going to see that that Andrew Jackson is going to support this idea 3 decades later. Jefferson believed that the only power that the federal government has was powers that were expressly given to it. And any power that's not expressly given to the federal government should be reserved for the states. That can be found in the 10th Amendment. A really good example of this is, for example, who has the power to declare laws unconstitutional? Now, you know the answer to that question in 2017, but I'm talking to you in 1800. So who has the power to declare laws unconstitutional in 1800? It's not clearly defined in the Constitution. It doesn't say it. So if it doesn't say it, those powers are reserved for the states. So Kennedy, where'd that come from? Jefferson, along with his good friend Madison, write the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution. And in the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution, they say that Virginia and Kentucky will nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts because they believe them to be unconstitutional. Now, this is really interesting later on when we find out what John Marshall does. And I know you already watched the Marbury versus Madison screencast. So this is very interesting about who has the power to declare laws unconstitutional. Jefferson said it's the states. John Marshall is going to say it's the federal government, specifically the Supreme Court, which is a branch of the federal government. So strict constructionists of the Constitution believed in limiting the power of the federal government. Doesn't that make sense? These are the same guys who fought the American Revolution. They're still fearful of a strong federal government. What about Hamilton? Hamilton believed in a loose construction of the Constitution, and there is a clause in the Constitution that seems to support him. It's called the Elastic Clause, and it says that the federal government can have any power that's necessary and proper for carrying out the powers given to it. I know this is a mouthful, some of these definitions, but you can always replay these videos if you need. But in short, it's probably best taught through example. So, for example, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the federal government can have a national bank. What Hamilton said, excuse me, was that it does say that the federal government can collect taxes. Therefore, it is necessary and proper for the federal government to have a bank. Do you see how the necessary and proper clause works? If it's needed, if it makes sense, is how we might say it today, then it's okay for them to do it. Jefferson is going to disagree. Jefferson's going to say, yeah. Now, sometimes kids are like, well, what did Jefferson want them to do with the money? Jefferson would say that the state should have the bank, that of course the money has to go somewhere. And of course we need banks, but these should be state banks, not federal banks. And this is essentially the heart of the disagreement between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans are going to believe in a weaker federal government and a more empowered state government. And you guys, of course, remember the whole debate about the Articles of Confederation. So this makes sense. That debate doesn't go away with this new Constitution. Debate over foreign policy. Well, this one's a lot easier. I'm going to do this very quickly. In short, you know that Jefferson was pro-French, and he wanted to support France in their wars. Washington comes out strongly with the Neutrality Proclamation. He says we're too weak to get involved in some foreign war. And Hamilton is a believer that the future of America is tied with England. And here's the thing, I know the play's out and I like it a lot, but I don't want you to misunderstand history with just, I like the play. It just happens to be that the play is very good history. Hamilton was really right about almost everything, but what he was right about wasn't very popular. Nobody, I shouldn't say no one, but not many people were pro-English in America in 1796. We had just fought the American Revolution with them. They are our enemies. But Hamilton was someone who thought of the future, and he saw the writing on the wall, and he knew that England was our future. We see this play out with the Jay's Treaty, where Hamilton worked behind the scenes to make it hard for Jay to negotiate and sign a formative treaty, a treaty that actually accomplished something. All right, moving along. So remember, I started this PowerPoint presentation with you, and I said this is going to be a greatest hits. This is the slide that I was really thinking about. I could even push this to 1836, actually. Not that I'm going to be so picky about it, but this is the slide. I want to really rattle off and go through with you some of the most important aspects of these years. Listen carefully, because these aspects are all relevant to the trial that you're working on, and more importantly than that, the next 30 years of history. So I'm going to do it quick because I know you know these things. I know you've been reading, and I know you've been watching other screencast videos. But the XYZ affair, in which the French demand bribes from Americans, They don't give their names. That's why it has this kind of algebraic name to it, X, Y, Z. In math, you don't know what X, Y, or Z is. So we didn't know who actually did this because it wasn't made public. But this angered Americans greatly, and this is going to be a real impetus for the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts, you know all about, were laws that limited the freedom of speech and rights of new immigrants. Jefferson and Madison are going to write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which give the states the power to nullify federal law. I'm sure you see that this has a major implications about the interpretation of the Constitution. Number one, does the federal government have this much power? Number two, do the states have this much power to nullify federal law? Think about how dangerous that is, by the way. If the states could nullify federal law, then essentially the federal government would have almost no power at all. This leads to a quasi-war with France. There's a quasi-naval war in which American Navy, we fire on French ships and vice versa when they see us. This is not a full-blown declaration of war, but there are hostilities with France. The national bank debate, whether or not the federal government has the power to have a national bank. Again, this involves the interpretation of the Constitution. I talked about that in the last slide, so I think I'll just move forward. Marbury versus Madison. Well, I gave you a whole big screencast on that. I personally find Marbury versus Madison to be a fascinating case and just a chess match between two geniuses. And that with a little more clarity, because I don't think I get into the Virginia and Kentucky resolution in that other screencast. With a little more clarity, you can see how Jefferson believed that the state should have this power to nullify federal law. And John Marshall, in a brilliant maneuver, gives that power to the Supreme Court. And in giving that power to the Supreme Court, he does it in such a way that Jefferson cannot fight against it. It's really one of the most brilliant decisions and one of the most brilliant political maneuvers in American history. The Embargo Act. So when we talk about this trial, one of the things that we're interested in is how do other presidents deal with these issues? The issue, of course, is impressment. And with impressment, American sailors are being hijacked at sea. So we know how John Adams handles it. How does Jefferson handle it? Well, Jefferson is a Southerner. Jefferson cares about farmers. Jefferson doesn't care that much. I don't want to sound like he doesn't care, but Jefferson's sectional politics does not necessitate him to care that much about the North, Northeast, New England, who are involved in trading. So for Jefferson, protecting American trade on the high seas is a thorny issue that he'd rather not get involved with. So he issues this Embargo Act where he just closes off trade. This has horrible repercussions for America's economy. This was criticized greatly. If you look at embargo, if you spell embargo backwards, it's "Oh, grab me." There was this political cartoon called the "Oh, grab me" turtle that was very critical of Jefferson's policy, and it makes for an interesting debate. Whether or not Adams handled the situation by abiding by the Constitution or not is interesting. But did Jefferson handle it well? Widely considered to be Jefferson's greatest failure as president. The Louisiana Purchase. So Jefferson, I was talking to a student about this, and I want everyone to kind of hear this. I'll get to the War of 1812 in a second. But Jefferson, it's easy to categorize Jefferson as a hypocrite. And the Louisiana Purchase is a good example of this. Nowhere in the Constitution, remember the national bank discussion? Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that you can have a national bank. Hamilton says, well, if it's necessary and proper, you can have one. And Jefferson vehemently disagreed. Well, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that you can buy land, that the president can buy land. It does say that the president can negotiate a treaty. So Jefferson kind of shoehorns the purchase of land into a treaty. Essentially, Jefferson uses the elastic clause almost word for word in the same manner that Hamilton used it. Hamilton, of course, used it to make a bank. Jefferson used it to buy the Louisiana Territory. So one way to look at Jefferson is that Jefferson is a huge hypocrite. I'm a little bit more kind to Jefferson, and I would describe him as a pragmatic idealist. So what do I mean by that? He is an idealist. I mean, he's a revolutionary at heart. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. You might remember that quote following Shays' Rebellion. And he's the author of the Declaration of Independence. And he had these visions of democratic yeoman farmers, having an ownership in America. He's a very idealistic guy. But when push came to shove, he was pragmatic. He was practical. He did what was the best for the country. And there's great documents about this. He believed that he would go down in history as a hypocrite. And he said, I have to paraphrase, he said, if future generations look poorly upon me, I will take that because what I did for the good of the country. Now, future generations don't look poorly. Future generations don't get involved in the academic debate of strict and loose construction of the Constitution, unless you're in an AP American history class, that is. But Jefferson did what he felt was right with the Louisiana Purchase. I'm moving along. I'm going to wrap this up soon just because I don't want to give you an hour screencast to listen to. I'm going to try to keep it more on the brief side. So War of 1812. Now, look at this. We are only, let me do the math here, we're only 14 years removed from when our Navy was firing at the French. But now Madison's president. Madison's a Democratic Republican. Under John Adams, we viewed the French as our enemy. John Adams was a Federalist. He was more pro-English. Under James Madison, we're viewing the English as our enemy. The Federalists were more pro-French. It's interesting. I don't think we see this today. It's not like if one party comes into power, all of a sudden, ISIS is no longer a group that we fear or consider an enemy. They're our enemy throughout. But back then, who we viewed as an enemy really changed with who was in power. So the English are doing exactly what the French were doing to Americans, something called impressment, and James Madison starts a war over it. Now that war is going to limit trade. Uh, New Englanders, excuse me, are going to be very much opposed to the war against England because it infringes on their trade. A group of New England politicians meet at Hartford, Connecticut, and when they're there, they pass this resolution called the Hartford Convention. The, this resolution threatened secession. It's interesting because when we think of secession, we always think of the South and the Civil War, but that's not the first time that it came up. The first time that secession came up was during the War of 1812, and it was actually Northerners who threatened secession over the War of 1812. The War of 1812, as we're going to find out, although we're not going to find it out tonight because I'm about to wrap this up, but the War of 1812 was a very patriotic war. It's where our Star-Spangled Banner comes from. You can go to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. and see the flag. To this day, it's considered to be a patriotic war. And because Federalists came out opposed to the war, this is going to destroy the Federalist Party. There are no Federalists today, and there haven't been for quite a while, and it's because of the Hartford Convention. I know I mentioned John Marshall being called the ghost of the Federalist Party. This is largely why. The era of good feelings. After James Madison, there's no more Federalists. The president following James Madison was a guy by the name of James Monroe. James Monroe virtually runs unopposed. There's only one political party. A lot of people were like, oh, okay. So it took a few years hammer out the wrinkles, but now I guess we're just going to have one political party and there'll never be partisanship again. They actually thought that for a brief period of time in America, and it's called the era of good feelings. We will talk more about that and more about other things as soon as I get back. So I can't tell you how much I miss being in school, not just because I miss being in school. And I can't wait to get back there. So I'm going to wrap it up just a little early here because I think that's probably enough for you guys. Have a good weekend. I hope to see you soon.